The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon, folded with a care that felt almost ceremonial and sealed with a faint trace of wax that had long since cracked into delicate veins, and when Brian turned it over in his hands he noticed the paper carried a scent of salt and something older, something like wind that had traveled too far to remember where it began. He had not received a letter in years, not since he had left the coast behind and chosen a life inland among slow days and predictable nights, yet the handwriting on the envelope stirred a distant familiarity he could not immediately place, as though it belonged to someone he had once known in a dream. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile edges. And inside found a single page covered in sparse, deliberate lines that read like instructions rather than a message, telling him to return to the lighthouse at the edge of Greywake Point, the one that had been abandoned decades ago, the one people spoke of only in softened voices as if afraid it might still be listening. He frowned at the name, Greywake Point, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere behind his ribs, because it was not entirely unfamiliar, and yet he could not recall ever visiting such a place, though something in him insisted he had once stood there, watching waves strike black stone under a sky that never fully brightened. The letter bore no signature, only a final line that lingered in his thoughts long after he finished reading. A line that simply said, "You were always meant to come back," and for reasons he could not explain, Brian felt no urge to dismiss it as nonsense or mistake, but instead experienced a quiet certainty that the letter had found the right person after a long and patient journey. He set it on the table and looked out the window at the gentle inland hills, where the air carried no salt and the wind spoke only in soft rustles through dry grass, and for a moment he wondered how a place so calm could suddenly feel like a waiting room for something far older and more insistent than his current life. As evening approached, he found himself packing a small bag without fully deciding to do so. Moving through the motions with a calm that bordered on sleepwalking, as though some deeper part of him had already accepted the invitation and begun the journey before his conscious mind could protest. He paused only once, holding the letter again and tracing the faint, uneven ink with his thumb, noticing how the words seemed slightly faded at the edges, as if they had been written long ago and only recently delivered, and that detail stirred a quiet unease that did not quite reach fear but lingered close to it. When night finally settled, Brian stepped outside and felt a breeze brush against his face, and though it carried no trace of the sea, he could not shake the sensation that somewhere far beyond the horizon, waves were already moving in anticipation of his return, whispering to one another about the lighthouse keeper who had been lost and was now, at last, finding his way back. By morning Brian was already on the road, though he could not recall the exact moment he had decided to leave, only the quiet certainty that had settled into him during the night like a tide rising without sound, and as he traveled farther from the familiar inland hills the air began to change in ways so subtle they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, growing heavier, richer, as though it carried stories suspended within it. The path he followed was not marked on any map he owned, yet each turn felt inevitable, guided by a memory that existed just beyond the reach of thought, and several times he found himself anticipating bends in the road before they appeared, as if the land itself were reminding him where to go. The trees grew taller and darker the farther he walked, their branches weaving together overhead to form shifting patterns of shadow that moved like slow currents, and every so often the wind would pass through them with a sound that resembled distant waves, a soft and rhythmic hush that made him pause and listen, unsure whether it came from the forest or from somewhere deep within him. As the day wore on, the scent of salt returned, faint at first and then unmistakable, threading through the air with a persistence that stirred something old in his chest, something that felt less like memory and more like recognition, as though the sea had always been a part of him even when he lived far from its reach. He passed no other travelers, no houses, no signs of life beyond the occasional bird that watched him from a branch with an unsettling stillness, and the silence of the road became its own companion, wrapping around him in a way that felt neither lonely nor entirely comforting, but instead expectant, as though the journey itself were observing him. At one point he stopped beside a weathered stone marker half hidden by moss, its surface worn smooth by time, yet when he brushed his fingers across it he felt a faint vibration beneath the stone, a pulse so subtle he might have imagined it, except that it seemed to echo in his fingertips long after he stepped away. The sky above gradually shifted from clear blue to a muted gray that softened the light and blurred the edges of everything around him. And with that change came a growing sense that he was crossing not just distance but something less tangible, a boundary between the life he had known and something older, something that had been waiting long before he was born. As dusk approached, he began to hear it clearly, the distant, steady rhythm of waves striking rock, and the sound filled him with a strange calm that settled his thoughts and slowed his breath, as if each wave were gently guiding him forward. When the road finally opened onto a narrow stretch of land overlooking the sea, Brian stopped and looked out at the vast, dark water stretching toward a horizon that seemed too far away to belong to the same world, and there, standing alone against the dimming sky, he saw the lighthouse at Greywake Point, tall and silent, its light unlit, yet somehow watching him as though it had known all along that he would return. The path that led to the lighthouse narrowed as Brian approached, winding along the edge of dark stone cliffs where the sea below moved with a slow, deliberate force, each wave striking the rock with a sound that felt less like impact and more like a steady breathing, and as he walked he noticed how the wind no longer passed around him but through him, carrying with it a quiet resonance that settled deep in his chest. The lighthouse stood taller than it had seemed from a distance, its surface marked by years of salt and storm, yet there was something intact about it, something that refused to yield entirely to time, as if it had been preserved not by care but by purpose. He paused at the base of the structure and looked up. Tracing the spiral of narrow windows that climbed toward the dark lantern room at the top, and for a moment he felt a flicker of uncertainty, a question forming at the edge of his thoughts about whether he truly belonged here, but before he could dwell on it, the heavy wooden door before him shifted with a low, deliberate creak and slowly opened inward without his touch. Brian did not startle, though he felt the moment settle into him with a quiet weight, as if the lighthouse had recognized him and chosen to welcome him in its own time, and after a brief hesitation he stepped across the threshold. Inside, the air was cool and carried a faint scent of oil and salt, mingled with something older. Something like paper that had been turned too many times, and the circular room at the base was lit by a dim, diffuse glow that seemed to come from no single source but rather from the walls themselves. A narrow staircase curved upward along the inner wall, disappearing into shadow, and beside it stood a small wooden table upon which rested a lantern, unlit yet warm to the touch when Brian brushed his fingers against it, as though it had only just been set down. He moved further inside, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone, and as he did he became aware of a presence that was not quite visible yet impossible to ignore, a sense that he was not alone in the lighthouse but rather accompanied by something that observed without judgment or urgency. On the far wall he noticed a series of hooks, some empty and others holding weathered coats that seemed untouched by dust despite their age, and without fully understanding why, he reached out and ran his hand along one of them, feeling the fabric shift slightly as if stirred by a breath. The sound of the sea was different here, muted yet deeper, as though it resonated through the structure itself, and with each passing moment Brian felt his earlier uncertainty dissolve into a quiet acceptance that bordered on familiarity, as if he were not entering a forgotten place but returning to one that had been waiting patiently for him. He glanced once more at the open door behind him, expecting perhaps to feel the pull of the world he had left. But instead he felt only a gentle stillness, and as the door slowly closed on its own with a soft and final sound, Brian turned toward the spiral staircase and began to climb, guided not by sight but by a calm and steady knowing that whatever awaited him above had already begun to remember him. The staircase curved upward in a slow, unbroken spiral, each step worn smooth in a way that suggested countless passages over many years, and as Brian ascended he noticed that his footsteps grew quieter, as though the lighthouse itself were absorbing the sound and folding it into its walls. The air became warmer the higher he climbed, carrying with it a faint golden hue that seemed to gather from no visible source, and by the time he reached the next level he felt as though he had stepped not just into another room but into a different layer of time. The space he entered was circular and modest, furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a chair positioned near a small window through which the sea could be seen in muted tones of gray and silver. And despite the years of abandonment the room was not in disrepair but instead held a quiet order, as if it had been kept ready for someone's return. On the desk lay a journal bound in dark leather, its surface marked by fine cracks that traced delicate patterns like dried riverbeds, and beside it rested a small brass compass whose needle trembled slightly despite the stillness of the room. Brian approached the desk with a calm curiosity, drawn to the journal by a feeling that was less like interest and more like recognition, and when he opened it he found the pages filled with careful handwriting that shifted subtly from line to line, as though written by the same hand across different years yet never entirely the same. The entries spoke not of events but of observations, of the sea's changing moods, of nights when the light burned brighter than usual without explanation, and of moments when the horizon seemed to draw closer, as if listening. As he read, Brian became aware of a peculiar detail. The most recent entry was not dated years ago as he expected, but instead carried a date that felt unsettlingly near, and the final line written there caused his breath to slow as he read it again and again: "He will return before the light goes out." He closed the journal gently, his fingers lingering on its cover, and turned his attention to the window where the sea stretched outward in a vast and quiet expanse, its surface moving with a rhythm that now felt intimately familiar, like a heartbeat that had always been there beneath his awareness. The compass on the desk gave a soft metallic click, and when he glanced back at it he saw that the needle had steadied, pointing not toward any direction he recognized but instead aligning with the center of the room, as if the true north it followed existed within the lighthouse itself. A subtle shift passed through the air then, a deep and almost imperceptible hum that seemed to rise from the stone beneath his feet, and with it came the sense that something within the structure had awakened further, responding not to his presence alone but to his arrival in this specific place. Brian moved toward the bed and sat for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle around him, and though he could not yet fully understand why, he felt no urge to leave this room or to question the strangeness of what he had found, because somewhere deep within him a calm certainty had begun to take shape, one that suggested he had not come here to discover something new, but to remember something that had been waiting, patiently and without end, for him to return. Brian remained seated for a time, watching the slow movement of the sea through the narrow window, until the subtle hum within the lighthouse deepened into something more tangible, a vibration that seemed to rise through the stone and into his bones, not unsettling but deliberate, as though the structure itself were calling him further upward. He stood without hesitation, leaving the journal closed upon the desk, and returned to the spiral staircase where the air now carried a faint warmth that had not been there before, a warmth that felt neither natural nor artificial but instead like the lingering presence of something that had once been alive. As he climbed higher, the sound of the sea faded into a distant murmur, replaced by a quiet resonance that pulsed at regular intervals, slow and steady, like a signal repeating itself across time. When he reached the top of the staircase, he found himself standing at the threshold of the lantern room, where the great glass panels curved outward to reveal the endless horizon, and at the center stood the massive lens, dark and silent, its intricate surfaces catching the dim light of the sky and scattering it in faint, fragmented reflections. The room felt vast despite its confined space, as though it extended beyond its visible boundaries, and Brian stepped inside with a sense of reverence he could not explain, drawn toward the unlit beacon that had once guided ships through treacherous waters. He approached the mechanism slowly, noticing how the metal framework showed no sign of decay, as if it had been preserved in a state of quiet readiness, waiting not for repair but for recognition. When he reached out and placed his hand upon the cold surface of the lens, the hum intensified, spreading outward in a gentle wave that passed through the room and into the sky beyond, and for a brief moment the glass seemed to catch a flicker of light from within, a faint glow that appeared and vanished before he could be certain it had been real. Brian did not pull his hand away, though a strange sensation moved through him, not pain but a deep and distant familiarity, as if he were touching something he had once known intimately and had somehow forgotten. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind them he sensed the presence of the light not as a physical flame but as something quieter and more enduring, something that did not burn yet still illuminated, existing beyond the need for fuel or flame. The pulse beneath his hand aligned with the rhythm of his breath, and for a moment he felt as though he were standing at the center of something vast and unseen, a point where time folded gently inward upon itself. When he opened his eyes again, the horizon seemed closer than before, the line between sea and sky softened into a single, continuous expanse, and the stillness of the lighthouse carried a new weight, not emptiness but expectation. Brian withdrew his hand at last, though the sensation lingered in his fingertips, and as he stepped back he became aware that the darkness within the lens was not absence but dormancy, a waiting that had endured longer than any ordinary light could survive. The quiet hum faded slightly, settling into a steady presence that filled the room without overwhelming it, and Brian understood, though he could not yet put it into words, that the light had not gone out because it had failed, but because it had been waiting for something, or someone, to return and remember how it was meant to shine. Brian remained in the lantern room, his gaze resting on the darkened lens as the steady hum settled into a quieter rhythm, one that seemed to echo faintly beyond the walls of the lighthouse and out into the vast expanse of sea, and as he listened more closely he began to notice another sound woven beneath it, something softer and more fluid, like a distant voice carried through water. At first it was indistinct, no more than a shifting tone that rose and fell with the movement of the waves below, but gradually it gained shape, forming patterns that felt almost like language, though not one he could consciously understand. He stepped closer to the glass panels, placing his hand lightly against the cool surface. And as he did the sound grew clearer, resonating not in his ears but somewhere deeper, as if it were speaking directly into the spaces between his thoughts. The sea stretched endlessly before him, its surface now darker, reflecting the dim sky in long, quiet swells, and with each passing moment the voice seemed to draw nearer, not approaching in distance but in clarity, as though it had always been present and he was only now learning how to hear it. A sense of recognition stirred within him, accompanied by a faint, almost forgotten memory of standing in this very place long ago, listening to the same quiet call and understanding it in a way that felt as natural as breathing. The words, if they could be called that, carried no urgency or command, but instead a patient invitation, repeating itself with a calm persistence that neither demanded nor faded, simply existing until it was acknowledged. Brian closed his eyes once more, allowing the sound to move through him without resistance, and as he did fragments of something older began to surface, impressions rather than images, of long nights spent tending the light, of watching the horizon for signs that others might miss, and of a connection to the sea that went beyond observation, something closer to companionship. The voice seemed to respond to this quiet remembering, its tone deepening into something almost warm. Like a presence that recognized him in return, and for a moment he felt the boundary between himself and the world beyond the glass grow thin, as though he could step forward and be carried into the vast, dark water without fear. He opened his eyes slowly, and the horizon appeared to shift again, not moving but aligning, as if it were adjusting itself to match something within him, and the gentle rhythm of the waves below now felt synchronized with the steady pulse he had sensed in the lighthouse. The voice softened, fading back into the sound of the sea, yet leaving behind a lingering awareness that it had not truly gone, only receded, like a tide that would return in its own time. Brian stepped back from the glass, his thoughts calm yet altered, carrying with them the quiet certainty that the lighthouse had never been merely a structure to guide ships, but a place of listening, a point of connection between what was seen and what moved unseen beneath the surface. And as the last trace of the voice dissolved into the rhythm of the waves, he understood, not as a conclusion but as a gentle unfolding, that whatever had called him here was not separate from him, but something he had once been part of, something that was now, slowly and patiently, beginning to remember him as he remembered it. Brian descended from the lantern room with unhurried steps, the quiet resonance of the lighthouse now settled into him like a second pulse, steady and familiar, and when he returned to the keeper's room he noticed at once that something had changed, though nothing appeared outwardly different. The journal still rested on the desk where he had left it, the compass beside it unmoving, yet the air carried a subtle expectancy, as though the room itself had been waiting for him to return. He approached the desk and placed his hand lightly on the journal's cover, feeling a faint warmth beneath his palm that had not been there before, and without hesitation he opened it again. The pages shifted softly, as if stirred by a breath, and his eyes were drawn immediately to the final entry he had read earlier, but now, beneath the last line, new words were forming, not appearing all at once but emerging slowly, letter by letter, as though written by an unseen hand moving in careful, deliberate strokes. Brian did not pull away, nor did he question what he was witnessing, because the movement of the ink felt strangely natural, like watching a tide advance across the shore, inevitable and unforced. The words continued to take shape, and as they did he felt a quiet recognition unfolding within him, the handwriting no longer unfamiliar but intimately known, as though he had spent years shaping those very letters. The new entry did not describe the past or predict the future, but instead recorded the present moment with a calm clarity, noting his arrival, his ascent, the touch of his hand upon the lens, and the voice he had heard within the sea, each detail captured with a precision that felt less like observation and more like memory being restored. Brian leaned closer, his breath slow and even, and as he watched the final lines complete themselves he noticed something that stirred a deeper awareness. The perspective of the writing was shifting, no longer describing him as someone separate, but as something continuous, a presence that extended beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. He turned the page carefully, and to his quiet astonishment found that the next page was already filled, though he had not seen it written, and the words there spoke of nights yet to come, of the light returning not in flame but in understanding, and of a keeper who was never truly lost, only waiting to remember the rhythm of his purpose. The compass beside the journal gave another soft click, its needle now spinning slowly before settling once more toward the center of the room, and Brian followed its direction with his gaze, feeling the faint pull of something that existed not in space but in awareness, a point of stillness around which everything else seemed to move. He closed the journal gently. Though he knew the writing within it had not ended, only paused, and as his fingers lingered on the cover he felt a subtle shift within himself, as though the boundary between reader and writer had begun to dissolve. The room grew quieter, the soft hum of the lighthouse blending seamlessly with the distant rhythm of the sea, and in that stillness Brian understood that the journal was not simply recording his journey, but continuing it, unfolding each moment as both memory and creation. And as he stood there, the faint warmth of the journal still present beneath his hand, he realized that the story it held was not something he had come to discover, but something he had always been part of. Now returning to him line by line, as patiently and inevitably as the tide. As evening settled beyond the narrow window, Brian expected the familiar descent of night, the gradual dimming of the sky into shadow, yet what unfolded was something quieter and far less defined, as though the light of the world had chosen not to disappear but simply to soften into a state between presence and absence. The horizon dissolved into a seamless blend of sea and sky, and the usual markers of distance faded until everything appeared suspended in a gentle, unbroken expanse. Drawn by a calm that felt deeper than rest, Brian made his way once more up the spiral staircase, each step carrying him not toward a destination but into a growing stillness that seemed to welcome him from within. When he reached the lantern room again, he found it unchanged and yet entirely different, the great lens still dark, yet now holding within it a subtle clarity, as though it were no longer empty but quietly aware. The glass panels surrounding the room reflected no stars, no moon, and yet the space was not dark, instead filled with a diffuse glow that had no visible source, a light that seemed to exist everywhere at once without casting shadows. Brian stepped closer to the center, his movements slow and unforced, and as he did the gentle hum of the lighthouse aligned once more with his breath, the two rhythms merging until they were indistinguishable. He placed his hand upon the lens again. And this time the response was immediate, not a flicker but a steady, quiet illumination that spread through the glass like a memory returning to the surface. The light did not shine outward in beams or arcs, but instead expanded softly, filling the room and extending beyond it in a way that felt less like projection and more like presence. Brian closed his eyes, and within the calm brightness he sensed no boundary between himself and the light, no distinction between observer and source, only a continuous awareness that flowed without interruption. The sea below, though unseen, carried the same gentle luminosity, its movements now part of a larger stillness that held everything in quiet balance. Time seemed to loosen its hold, each moment unfolding without urgency, without beginning or end, and Brian felt himself settle into that timeless space with a sense of belonging that required no explanation. The light within the lens remained steady, neither growing nor fading, simply existing as it always had, waiting not to be lit but to be recognized. When Brian opened his eyes, the world appeared unchanged and yet entirely transformed, the absence of darkness revealing not emptiness but a deeper form of clarity, one that did not depend on contrast or definition. He stepped back slightly, though the light did not recede, and as he stood within its quiet presence he understood that what had once been called night was not a loss of light, but a different way of holding it, a softer, more patient expression that allowed everything to rest without disappearing. And in that gentle, endless glow, Brian no longer felt as though he had arrived at the lighthouse, but as though he had always been there, part of its quiet watch, its steady awareness, its unbroken connection to the sea and whatever lay beyond it. Brian remained within the quiet glow of the lantern room, though the sense of remaining no longer carried meaning as it once had, because time had softened into something fluid and unmeasured, and the distinction between moments had dissolved into a continuous presence that neither advanced nor paused. The light within the great lens held steady, not as a beacon cast outward but as a calm awareness that extended gently in all directions, touching sea and sky without dividing them, and as Brian stood within it he felt no separation between himself and its source, only a quiet recognition that deepened with each breath. The memories that had once seemed distant now unfolded with a clarity that required no effort. Not arriving as fragments but as a seamless knowing, and within that knowing he understood that the role of the keeper had never belonged to a single lifetime, but existed as a continuity, a presence that moved through time without being bound by it. He saw, not with his eyes but with a quiet inner awareness, the countless nights that had passed within this tower, the steady turning of the lens, the silent watching of horizons that shifted and returned, and through it all the same calm attention that now rested within him. The idea of absence faded, replaced by the understanding that nothing had ever truly been lost, only forgotten for a while, like a tide that retreats not to vanish but to gather strength before returning once more. The voice he had heard within the waves returned again, though now it no longer felt separate, no longer something that called from beyond, but something that spoke from within the same stillness that held the light, and its tone carried a quiet affirmation that needed no translation. Brian moved toward the glass, though movement itself had become a gentle suggestion rather than a necessity, and as he looked out over the endless sea he saw not distance but continuity, each wave part of a larger rhythm that extended far beyond what could be seen. The lighthouse no longer felt like a structure he inhabited, but like an extension of the same awareness that moved through him, its walls and stairs and silent rooms all part of a greater whole that existed without beginning or end. The journal below, the compass, the winding path that had led him here, all of it remained, yet none of it held the weight it once had, because their purpose had been fulfilled not in guiding him to a place, but in guiding him back into a state of remembering. The light within the lens did not grow brighter, nor did it dim, because it no longer functioned as a signal to be seen, but as a presence to be known, steady and unchanging. Brian felt no desire to leave, not because he was bound to remain, but because the notion of leaving had lost its meaning, replaced by a quiet understanding that wherever the light existed, he existed with it, and wherever he existed, the light remained. The sea continued its slow and endless motion, the horizon resting in its soft, indistinct line, and within that vast stillness Brian recognized the truth that had been waiting patiently beneath every step of his journey, that the keeper had never been lost, had never truly departed, but had simply drifted for a time away from awareness, only to return again, as gently and inevitably as the tide. There was no final moment, no clear boundary where one state ended and another began, only a gentle settling into something that had always been present, waiting without urgency or demand, and as Brian stood within the quiet radiance of the lantern room he understood that what felt like an ending was simply the completion of a remembering. The lighthouse remained as it always had, its spiral stairs, its silent rooms, its patient walls shaped by time and tide, yet none of it felt separate anymore, because the distinction between place and presence had dissolved into a single, continuous awareness. The light within the lens neither called nor guided in the way it once had, and yet it fulfilled its purpose more completely than ever. Not as a signal to distant ships but as a steady expression of something deeper, something that did not depend on distance or direction. The sea moved in its endless rhythm, each wave rising and falling with a calm inevitability that mirrored the quiet pulse Brian now felt within himself, and the voice that had once seemed to come from beneath those waters had become inseparable from the stillness that surrounded and sustained everything. There was no longer a need to listen for it, because it was always there, present in every movement, every pause, every subtle shift of the world as it breathed. Time, which had once carried him forward from one moment to the next, now unfolded in a way that felt both infinite and immediate. Each instant complete in itself, untouched by what came before or after. The journal remained on the desk below, its pages continuing to hold the story not as something written in sequence but as something existing all at once, every line a reflection of the same quiet truth, and the compass, no longer searching for direction, rested in its stillness, pointing always toward the center that had never moved. Brian did not think of himself as the keeper anymore, because the role implied separation, a distinction between the one who watched and the thing being watched, and that distinction had faded into something simpler and more complete, a state of being that required no name. The lighthouse did not stand alone against the sea. Nor did the sea stretch endlessly beyond it, because both existed within the same gentle continuity, held together by the same unbroken awareness that neither began nor ended. And so the light remained, not as a flame to be tended or a beacon to be restored, but as a quiet and enduring presence that asked nothing and gave everything, a stillness that welcomed all things without needing to hold them. If anyone were to pass by Greywake Point in some distant time, they might see the old lighthouse standing as it always had, unchanged and silent, and perhaps they would wonder whether its light had ever truly gone out, or whether it had simply taken on a form too subtle to be seen. And somewhere within that question, within that quiet curiosity, the answer would already exist, waiting as it always had, patient and certain, like the sea, like the horizon, like the light that does not fade, but remains.